And we're live. Welcome to episode 41 Wake Up Podcast. And I've got Thomas Strolight here with me. And he is the host of For the Love of Bitcoin podcast and a series of brilliant little articles actually that I've been passing around to all of my newbie friends called Why Bitcoin. And it's like a series of these little 3-minute bite-sized pieces which are just so well written. And, you know, someone can read like one of them a day. What are you up to? 21 of them at the moment or?
I think I've got 24 of them right now, and
Okay,
I'll probably write a handful more. But yeah,
awesome. Well, dude, thank you for coming on. And I know we connected in Breedlove's group around some a shared appreciation for Ayn Rand's work, which is I think what we're going to dig into today.
Right. Cool.
So, tell us a little bit about I guess your background. You mentioned before we spoke on the show that you've been around Bitcoin now for almost 8 years. Prior to that, your natural obsessive personality took you down the objectivist rabbit hole. So tell us a little bit about your journey, just so we've got some context, and then we'll start digging into some of these rabbit holes.
Yeah, sure. I'll play it backwards. So I first fell into the Bitcoin rabbit hole in 2013, started by reading the white paper, became quite intrigued, got my hands on some Bitcoin, lost a bunch of the Bitcoin, and just really fell deep in. I really wanted to understand how it worked. I knew that there was something there the first time I read the white paper, but I needed to know more. And so I ended up taking a course on cryptography and taking a course on Bitcoin that really explained everything about how Bitcoin actually operated. I became, one of these obsessive people who talked to everybody who would listen about Bitcoin. I wasn't really able to convince too many people, but of the few people I did convince, they're all grateful for it now. And I've just been super passionate about Bitcoin for 8 years. And as I said, I'm now writing these articles for newbies. I kind of view Bitcoin comes in these very short generations. Like I was born in 2013 and the next generation was born at the next halving in 2017. And now there's a new generation, my grandkids, who are born in 2021. And so I view this series of articles as kind of like me, this old, wizened, bristled Bitcoiner talking to his young grandkids about the time when Bitcoin had to go through a fork war and the time when there was the bear whale and all those things. But these articles are kind of meant to be kind of like fairy tales for kids. They're not telling these past stories, but they're like, why it's called Why Bitcoin, and every one of these article titles has the words why and Bitcoin in the title, and sometimes it's like why Bitcoin relies on the laws of physics, or why you should choose Bitcoin because it needs to be chosen, and so on. So that's what I'm doing in the Bitcoin space right now. Before I discovered Bitcoin, before it was presented to me, it was actually presented to me by an objectivist friend, objectivism being Ayn Rand's philosophy. I worked for 16 years at a newspaper company, Canada's largest newspaper, and I joined to help them launch a website because I was someone who had used the internet back in 1995 and had a business degree, which was pretty scarce. And I ended up rising through the organization there and doing a number of different things. I ended up running their entire digital division, which ended up being about 9 or 10 different business units, 400 employees, over $200 million in revenue. And through that part of the journey, even just before I became head of that newly formed division and led that division, I had stumbled across Ayn Rand's book, The Fountainhead. And it was what inspired me to actually take the reins of the digital division. I was doing a strategy role, which was called corporate development, which was one of these, I don't want to say it was a do-nothing job, but it wasn't real work in the sense of creating businesses and finding customers and giving them value. It was one of these head office jobs where you made presentations to the board of directors. And so the Fountainhead changed me. It told me that I had to be an independent human being doing something productive with my life. And it coincided with this opportunity. I had to start to run a business, and I finished reading The Fountainhead. I quickly said, what else did Ayn Rand write? I read Atlas Shrugged. I was blown away by Atlas Shrugged. It changed my personality again. And you know, people say Bitcoin changes you. They also say Ayn Rand's novels change you. There's so much about the world that's revealed, or its organization that's revealed. And then I discovered that Ayn Rand, after writing Atlas Shrugged, in a sense, before it was published, really had become a philosopher, because she had to create a whole philosophy, discover a whole philosophy in order to write that novel. And everybody was so curious. I mean, she was, even after The Fountainhead, she was surrounded by adoring fans who just said, I need to know more about your ideas. Your ideas are so profound. What's going on here? And that inspired her to write Atlas Shrugged, and it inspired her to write lots of other books afterward, and inspired one of her students to really, a man by the name of Leonard Peikoff, to become her protege, in a sense, her intellectual heir, is what I think what she called him when she passed on. And he taught dozens of courses about objectivism, initially with her present, and then after she passed, without her present, obviously. And he was a brilliant student of her work, and so really managed to catalog it in a philosophical format. And so there's a whole banquet of information to be consumed there. But I would say, if I'm talking to someone who is not familiar with Ayn Rand's work, begin with reading her first huge novel, which is The Fountainhead, and you know, hopefully that will persuade you that you're dealing with an incredible intellect, and then you'll be inspired to read Atlas Shrugged, which is a broader novel with many broader themes. I'm assuming it's Bitcoiners who are listening to this show. There's a lot in Ayn Rand's work for Bitcoiners, even just in the novels alone. I don't think you have to go all the way down the rabbit hole and listen to every philosophical course that's been taught about Ayn Rand. But if you have heard of Ayn Rand, you almost certainly have heard of her vilified in some way, presented as cold-hearted, as mean, as brutal, in the same way that if you weren't a Bitcoin maximalist and you heard of Bitcoin maximalists, you would have heard many of the same slanders against Bitcoiners. Right? You would have heard that they're toxic, that they are mean, and that their principles are represented as vices, right? Their virtues are represented as vices to the outside world. Bankers say that we're terrorists and drug dealers and criminals. Shitcoiners say that we're mean, and strangers say we're crazy. So just that alone. Now, not every single mean and crazy person who's accused of being mean and crazy is exactly like us. But I think the leap of faith that I would say, if you stopped listening to the podcast at this moment, and said, okay, fine, I'll take a leap of faith, I'll listen to The Fountainhead, you're going to encounter characters in The Fountainhead and in Atlas Shrugged who have strong principles, who use their mind, who look at reality and don't let other people tell them what to think if those other people are wrong. And I think that that's a very common cause with Bitcoiners. Right? We are, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, I actually, the first book that I read from Ayn Rand was Atlas Shrugged. And for me, that was, I guess I was already primed for it. So for me, it just sort of blew me away. It didn't, I wouldn't say it, I mean, yes, it did change me, but it kind of, my idea of the archetypal hero, I guess, in my mind, was very much someone like not Howard Rourke, because that's Fountainhead.
John Galt?
No, not John Galt. Dagny's original partner.
Hank
Rearden.
Or Sebastian.
Yeah. Oh,
Francisco d'Ancona.
So yeah, Francisco was incredible as well. So I just had a huge level of respect for Francisco, and particularly for Hank Rearden, and like those two for me, when I read that book, were like I don't know, shining examples of what it means to be a man of principle. And like that book genuinely shook me to the core. Like to this day, it's a highly recommended book. But what I asked was, you mentioned she started developing the philosophy after she wrote the book, and I had to pull on that because I remember reading the foreword to Atlas Shrugged, and you know, I remember whether it was the foreword to Atlas Shrugged or whether it was on her on a video or something, where she was just discussing how she philosophy in her head, but she didn't want to just down as like some theoretical abstraction of this is what I believe. She wanted to weave it into a novel. So it's kind of like, I was under the impression the philosophy came first.
I didn't mean to give the different impression. What I did mean to say was, so many people were so curious about her philosophy from the book, and they said they needed it spelled out, because not everything in her philosophy is spelled out in the book. Her whole theory of epistemology, which is how we know things, she couldn't find a way to work it into the dramatization of a novel. So that all had to wait for a book afterwards. But I think what you're referencing, which is in the foreword to Atlas Shrugged, is she reflected on herself as a writer in it, and she said, you know, there are so many writers who take other people's ideas and try to write original novels using old ideas. They take someone else's philosophy and they apply a philosophy. There are people who there are writers who take other people's philosophies and use them to write stories that have already been told before. She said, as far as I can see in the world, I'm the only person who's actually created a whole original philosophy to create an artwork around it. And that was that was the observation that she made there. And so she really had to develop, I think she had a working knowledge of her ideas in the Fountainhead, but she hadn't fully developed her theories yet. In order to write Atlas Shrugged, she had to fully develop her theories. And it took her 14 years to write the novel. So just when you appreciate, like, I don't know how long it took Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, but it wasn't 14 years. And she is she is a, what do we call artists of that skill? She's like a grand master of writing. And so Atlas Shrugged, when you read it, in addition to the fact that it contains this extraordinary, original, radical philosophy, it's also really well written. Like it's a work from someone who has mastered the language and just done a beautiful job in weaving together a tale, and all the allegories in it and everything else is just really truly superb. And I think you can almost pick up on it even just when you read the opening chapter. And I don't want to spoil anything, but we've already spoiled by giving away the names of some characters. But just the flow of these stories and the scenes in these stories are absolutely incredible. So I'm sure we'll hint at a couple of them, but that's we're trailing off now in terms of philosophy and fiction, which are both pieces here. Well, maybe we'll go back to the fiction for a minute.
Was her first book was not The Fountainhead, right? Wasn't it Anthem or something? Or
she wrote two books before The Fountainhead. She wrote one called Anthem, which is a really interesting book for people who have read like dystopian short stories. It's shorter than say 1984, and it envisions a world in the future where collectivism has taken over and where people are numbers. They're not names, and she projected not that they would even have the bare essentials that they still only had left in 1984, but they'd lost electricity, for example, because how can you have electricity when nobody can think and nobody's motivated? So that's a really good read. It's even suitable for young people, because it projects this terrible future. And then she wrote another novel beforehand, also called We the Living, which is really about what life was like in the Soviet Union under communism. So she herself escaped communism in Russia, and so she knew what it was like. She watched her civilization get choked by communism, and so when she got to America, I think she really she needed to get out just her hatred of communism and to dramatize just how vicious it was, and so it's quite a tragic story to read. We the Living. It's painful. It does not have a happy ending, and it's kind of filled with tragedy. Not that I don't recommend reading it, but I do recommend starting for people who live in the West, especially something like The Fountainhead. Not that you can't read Atlas Shrugged as you did first. But it's the order that they were written in, so I always go for that. And it's the order I read it in, and I had a good experience. So maybe there's not much more.
Yes.
More to the recommendations.
See, I read Anthem, and I found like it was basically a like you said, a short version of 1984, but further out, and I mean it has a happy ending. As happy as can be, I guess. But I haven't read We the Living yet, so I'm gonna add that to the list. I mean, 1984 has a very sad fucking ending, so you know it's
true. Yeah,
I remember reading 1984, and that shook me by the end of it because I was waiting for something. You know, it was actually I read 1984 just after I read Anthem, and I was expecting something nice to happen at the end of 1984, and then it just sort of abruptly ended. I was like, wow.
Yeah,
that's disturbing.
I feel like I feel like it's okay to spoil 1984 because I presume that so many people have read it, but you do get your hope up in 1984, and you feel like that there could be some hope for humanity, and then it gets like and I will say that there's kind of a similar tragedy in We the Living, and I think that it is the view that live in a communist dictatorship or some kind of terrible dictatorship that cannot be overthrown or escaped. Death is the final, death, or worse is the outcome, right? A life of misery, and so that's what all of these dystopian books show. But you know, I don't want to leave this impression that there's this dystopianism to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is a huge believer in the capability of even just one man, right? Both her books, both of the books we're talking about, The Fountainhead, that one has a hero who faces tremendous opposition in what he's doing. He's trying to do something original, and faces tremendous opposition from incumbents, and overcomes. And Atlas Shrugged is ultimately, it's a story about, you know, this is not a spoiler because I think it says something on the back of it. It's a story about one man who said he'd stop the engine of the world and did. And so to know what that means, it's worth reading the book. But there's a beautiful heroic theme. And what Ayn Rand said she aimed to do in her novels was to dramatize and concretize the ideal vision of the vision of an ideal man, of an ideal hero. And she did an extraordinary job with these characters. You talked about your connection to some of them in Atlas Shrugged. It is amazing how quickly, you know, even only after reading chapter 1 or chapter 1 and chapter 2, this book I've handed out to more people than I've gotten to buy Bitcoin. So it's like, it was a big passion of mine. And always after chapter 1 or chapter 2, people would come in and say, oh, I so relate to this character. Ultimately, people couldn't carry through as much as heroically in life as these characters of hers did. But there's so much to connect to. There's so much to admire, and there's so much emotional fuel that you get from reading these books and seeing these heroes go through challenges that are very much like what you go through if you're trying to accomplish something in life.
Especially something that that goes against the grain or against the against, you know, the established norms. And like, I'm just gonna say one thing here is like, let's worrying about spoilers. I think we talk about the
Okay.
books freely because, you know, most people will have either read it or, to be honest, if they hear it here, they can go read it anyway, because like whatever spoiler we give is still not going to do justice to the whole book anyway.
So
But
let me just say one thing.
I
If you're keen to read the book, pause the podcast, go read the books. It'll only take you 55 hours or something to read these 2 books, and then come back and listen to the rest of the podcast. Because from here and, you know, beyond here lie spoilers. You've been warned.
There we go. All right, deal. So for me, I think one of the things that really I enjoyed about Atlas Shrugged is just how much almost like a guidebook or a manual, like it was for today, like how she to describe like the step-by-step destruction of, you know, the individual spirit within a collectivist framework, and like and just also the tragedy of those who are the productive members end up serfs. Basically, we keep carrying the fucking parasite that is the state, and it's sort of, we're the ones who end up feeding the parasite at the top, and we're the ones who feed the, you know, the bottom feeders who have given up, basically. And that's a dwindling number of people, and we're sort of seeing that happen in like a live action fucking role play today.
Right. Yeah. So in Atlas Shrugged, I think these 3 categories of people. Ayn Rand had what you call the producers, the men of the mind, the people who did work, and then she had these 2 categories. The category on top she called the looters, and the category on the bottom she called the moochers. We don't use the word mooching much anymore, but moochers, like living off of everybody else. And Atlas Shrugged takes place in some mysterious time in America. New York City's and Colorado prominently featured in it, and it's a time where government powers continue to increase, taxation continues to increase, regulations continue to increase. Businessmen are called in front of Congress to testify, to explain why they're doing what they're doing. They're asked to surrender their secret formulas for operating their businesses, all for the sake of the good of the common man, so that the politicians can help out everybody else, and the society is crumbling. And Ayn Rand does an incredible job of demonstrating that society run this way does crumble, how vicious it is, how cruel it is to the people who are actually able to save the society if they were just left alone to produce. And there's quite a few tense or high moments in the novel, which become these philosophical speeches that Ayn Rand is kind of famous for, that her characters deliver these tremendously powerful speeches at various parts in the novel. And so there are these wonderful scenes, and there's scenes that you'd love to see today, because the setup for the scenes occurs. Like when today's great businessmen are called in front of Congress to testify, and they have to answer to people who produce nothing in their life, right? Like these politicians in their whole lives have not done a single goddamn fucking thing, right? They are parasites, as you pointed out, and they sit there elevated at a higher level, looking down at the businessman who has created something that didn't exist before, that billions of people use, that billions of people find valuable, that billions of people pay for, and they tell that person to explain themselves. Right? So there's just a wonderful scene in Atlas Shrugged where Hank Rearden, one of the characters, a tycoon in the metal and mining industry, is summoned, and he gives it to the congressman who summoned him. He said, I don't respect your right to question me. I don't respect your authority. And it's a beautiful speech. And I'll leave it for the listeners to go and read those passages from the book. But it's moments like that that give people who are trying to do something with their lives, the emotional fuel, as I said before. Those are the kinds of things that say this, it's not just clever rhetoric, right? It's because she's got this philosophy behind it. It's truth, right? It's like the characters are able to say, this is reality, you know, and in reality, this is how things work. And that's what I'm doing. And that's why I'm right. That's why I'm moral, because what I'm doing corresponds to reality. And it's the reality of my life. I have to take care of my life. Nobody else can take care of it for me. Ultimately, somebody has to do the work. Somebody has to use their mind and figure out how reality works. And once you understand reality, then you can tame it, then you can do something with it. But to demand something from businessmen that they don't have to give, to tax higher and higher and higher levels to the point where you bankrupt companies that are doing real things and give the money to companies that are doing nothing. The ultimate end of that process is you bankrupt productive companies and everything else goes bankrupt, because nobody can live with nothing. These zombie companies, these pseudo companies that produce nothing, well, if they're not able to feed off of somebody who is producing something, they will starve, you know, and we will all starve if we don't let people who can actually produce something produce it. And that's really a big part of the theme and the plot.
That's one thing, yeah. That's the way she, because see, a lot of people, they misinterpret Ayn Rand as like, oh yeah, she's just all about big business, you know, like tycoons just having everything. And what she did really great, I think, emphasizing was this, the idea of that redistribution by some sort of state to their friends and pals, like to their cronies, to the extension of the state, which is sort of like the particularly with Reardon and whoever the other steel tycoon was, who was just a friend of Jim, basically.
Oren Boyle, right? That's right.
Oren Boyle, that's right.
Yeah.
And you know, in the process, just squandered all the resources, and then how she also just predicted how the media would actually operate around it, you know, and sort of like Oren Boyle, you know, was being praised for, you know, what was it, like the handouts to the school or something like that, the, you know, the free things that he was giving out. So it's like, that's where the focus was, instead of the failing factories that his shitty business was doing instead.
It's remarkable. I will say this: when I first read the book, I think it was probably in 2005 or 2006, and it felt really real like that too, right? Like it you know, it was around the time that that we were just heading into a financial crisis. We were seeing bailouts. The President of the United States was saying, "You didn't build that," and so it really felt a lot like there was an attack on business and the entrepreneur then. And I don't think it's gone away, right? I think things have continued to get worse. The novel continues to feel more and more accurate rather than less and less accurate. And we occasionally have some positive pullbacks, but it is a remarkable book. And one of the things about Atlas Shrugged, it's filled with characters. There are lots of characters. There are major characters. There are minor characters. Ayn Rand's villains aren't like, you know, like the Joker or the crazy murderers. They're flawed human beings, right? They're all true. They're altruists. They're thugs. They're liars. You can look at almost each and every one of them and say, oh, you know, that one's like Ben Bernanke, and that one is like, you can just you can see the characters in our society who are very similar, to her villains, with equal consequences on us as her villains have on that society. So it is remarkable, and I do know that as people, you know, when I used to hand out these books to people and they would read them, they'd say, oh yeah, this character totally reminds me of this person in our lives. Like if you're working at a business, it's like, oh, this person's just like my boss, right? Or he's just like the person who runs the other division. He's a phony baloney, and he just talks, you know, he knows how to dress up. He knows how to talk about tradition. He doesn't know how to run a business. So you end up with these really amazing characters, and she did a wonderful job bringing them forward. You know, one of the criticisms that critics leveled against her, and it was always amazing to me. I felt like, are we reading the same book? They would say her characters are flat or two-dimensional, but they're anything but. They're incredibly vivid. And if you actually read some of these books a second and the third time, you realize that the dialogue is actually so nuanced. And when you know more about the book later and you see what the characters are saying, it plays into itself even better. So they're great works of art. these novels, I really appreciate them.
Yeah, I think what you said there about like the villains and how they're not like these, you know, unidimensional DC fucking villains like the Joker or something like that, which,
right.
you know, like this, that kind of stuff I've never really, I mean, I actually think the best TV villains, for example, that I've seen, or the best movie villains were actually in the Christian Bale version of Batman. Like
Sure.
if we're gonna pull up Joker and that Bane, like Nolan actually did a fantastic job there of like bringing some depth to the villains. In general, most villains are just fucking pathetic. Like, I just want to take over the world and destroy the world. It's like, and that's just so untrue, because, you know, evil, I think, stems from like this emptiness and ignorance, and you know, there's sort of attempt to deny reality where A doesn't equal A. You know, if we're going to channel Ayn Rand there, it's like, you know, that's where evil stems from. And she just does such a good job of presenting these, basically these fools, right? These people who genuinely, like, in a sense, think that what they're doing is right. In some weird version of their universe.
They want, there's a pretense, you know, there's like a pretense that many of her villains play, which is they want to be seen as doing right. Like we have a phrase for that today, right? We call that virtue signaling. You know, that phrase didn't exist until recently, but you see her villains wanting to be seen as heroes, wanting to be seen as doing good. They don't actually have any kind of objective view of what the good is. The good is be good to your common man, sacrifice, right? It's all these altruist platitudes. But when you actually peel away, or when you look closely and you say, well, what good are you doing by sacrificing human beings to other human beings? What good are you doing by saying no one should, you know, everyone should suffer for the sake of other people? You're just creating mass suffering for no real sake at all. Like, and this is kind of what leads to that climax. And I think this is a really good observation that you make, is if evasion of the truth or failing to grasp the truth, reality, is right at the very core of her ethics. And this is, if we switch just for a moment to her philosophy, we can come back to this. But she does an incredible job in her philosophy tying together where reality fits and where morality fits, and how consciousness fits in between these two things. So we can either talk about that right now if you want, or we can
let's talk. Let's talk.
So at the very root of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, she's one of like only 3 or 4 philosophers in all of history who created a comprehensive philosophy that spanned everything from metaphysics to epistemology, to ethics, to politics, and even aesthetics in her case, art. The metaphysics being what is, epistemology being how we know it, like how our minds work, ethics being so what we should do about it, politics being how we should interact with each other, and aesthetics being art. And so before her, Plato, Aristotle, and Kant were kind of the only other philosophers who really had such wide-spreading, ambitious works. And she tried to present her philosophy in a way that many mathematicians actually managed to present the philosophy, which is to start with axioms, to start with these irrefutable truths. And in her philosophy, those truths are truths that are self-evident. There's only 3 of them. The first is existence. When Leonard Peikoff, her student, teaches the course, he says, we start with where you start in life as a baby, when you first open your eyes and you see that existence exists. We know that existence exists, and it's impossible to refute that existence exists. Someone who says, oh, I don't believe that existence exists, they have to presume that they exist to be able to refute that existence exists. So these are they defend themselves, and you know how we all love in Bitcoin how it defends itself. These axioms have these wonderful defenses. So the first is existence, just that it exists. The second is identity. This is not her discovery at all, neither the first one, but it's where she starts, an identity being the law of identity, that A is A, and what Aristotle called the law of identity, that a thing is what it is, and that it is not what it is not, and there's no middle. Right? It either is a thing or it is not a thing. There's no halfway in between. And then the third axiom is consciousness. Consciousness exists. Nobody can deny that consciousness exists. We may not know what its nature is, how it's composed, but that's a matter for scientists, not for philosophers. Consciousness exists. I'm conscious, you're conscious. There's no way you can deny that you're conscious. The act of denying is an act of consciousness, right? Of saying that my consciousness exists. Right. So existence, and then she makes what is perhaps the most important thing that leads to this ethics subsequently that we were just talking about, is that existence has primacy over consciousness. Consciousness doesn't have to exist in the universe. Consciousness can't exist without existence existing. You can't be a conscious thing, conscious of nothing. Even if you were the only thing in the universe and you were conscious, you would be conscious of your existence. But what's really important about this is the laws of the universe. They exist whether you're aware of them or not, right? And your perception of them doesn't change them, right? So existence has primacy over consciousness. And this is the error that all of these villains make in our real world and in her novels, whether they're fully aware of it or whether they just try to fight, or whether they try to fight it, but you can't fight reality. And she has a very famous quote that I'm probably going to misquote somehow, but she says, any man is free to ignore reality, but they're not free to ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Man, you can go out in the freezing cold weather without a shirt on, and say, it's warm to me. That's you trying to put your consciousness above reality, above existence. But the consequences are, reality doesn't care about your feelings. Reality doesn't care about your wants. And this is why Ayn Rand's philosophy and Ayn Rand are often painted as vicious. It's like, well, you don't care about feelings. It's like, it's not that she doesn't care about feelings and emotions. It's that she acknowledges that reality doesn't care about your feelings and your emotions. And so we are not born into a world with factories and knowledge of how to run nuclear reactors and sound money. We're born into a world of like rocks and plants and the sun shining and rivers, but the water in the rivers may be polluted, may be poisoned, may have bacteria. We have to learn all these things, and it doesn't care that we feel thirsty, right? The universe doesn't care. If we're thirsty, we need to find a source of clean drinking water. We may have to make clean drinking water. If we want to make clean drinking water for billions of people, we need water purification facilities. We have to figure out how to make these things. We need power, we need energy. And so this is where we see today, and in her novels, this clash between, for example, the environmentalists who don't want us to extract energy from the earth, who aren't concerned with the consequences of what we would do if we shut down the power. They're not concerned that the water purification plants run on energy. They're not concerned that the heating in our homes run on energy. They're not concerned by these things. They have this vision of a world that's nice and green and clean, and they don't want to be bothered with reality. And so they're making this first fundamental error of placing their wants, what Ayn Rand's, which is, these are people who place the I want above the it is. Right? Well, just what you want, it's fine to want something. You have to work in a way, you have to operate in a way that corresponds to what is. Right? And reality is, and it has primacy. So I'm kind of drilling this point home. I hope I'm not drilling it over too many points, but it's such a fundamental point about reality that it's worth hearing it a few times.
It really is. No, it really, really, really is. So what's I guess a question for you. So what you just mentioned there about like the greenies and everything wanting to stop the extraction of energy from the planet and all this sort of stuff, and just being ignorant to the potential ramifications of turning specific, life support systems for society off, for example. Like what in Atlas Shrugged, it plays out in an incredible way, and then we've got the sort of the Galt's gulch as the mechanism. It's just such a precursor for Bitcoin as the sort of the sanctuary where we can find refuge from bringing the whole thing down on top of themselves. Talk to me about how things are playing out in the real world, and where Ayn Rand was like just spot on, and where you think potentially maybe she wasn't.
It's really, so it's a it's a challenging question to say where was she spot on. I mean, she said that she wrote Atlas Shrugged, not because everyone said, "Oh my God, this book is so accurate in reflecting reality." She said, "I didn't write it to reflect reality. I wrote it so that we can avoid this, outcome that it looks like we're headed to, the outcome that happened in the book." And it's very hard. Like I'm really an optimist, but it's very hard to see any outcome that we're headed to, other than one where we're going to continue to see more and more collapse of our civilization. Right? And we're living in a world right now where planes are hardly flying, where cruise ships aren't operating, where restaurants aren't operating. It's really depressed. Movie theaters aren't fun, don't have people in. It's all under the guise of there's a deadly virus out there, but we're seeing our civilization collapse.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
It's all under the guise that she fucking warned us of, which is for the good of everybody, for the safety of the other. Like it's literally what is happening today is literally the warning she gave in the book. Is if we place these fucking platitudinal concepts above reality, this is what's going to happen. And here we are playing it away.
Yeah, and I think again, she didn't.
Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. She didn't dramatize these things happening in Atlas Shrugged through a virus. She dramatized them happening through systems failing because the politicians were suffocating those systems, and that every time the politicians broke something, their reaction would be to further break everything, right? To further regulate, to say, "Oh, you see, the market doesn't work," and they passed laws. I almost sometimes think that they were passing laws in Atlas Shrugged called the anti-dog eat dog rule, and these laws were all named exactly the opposite of what they were actually doing, because they had these virtuous sounding names, and that's what we see. That's certainly what we see today. Like if you have a law that says the Freeing People Law, the Patriot Act, right? Like okay, it's exactly the opposite of the idea that it's trying to be, and we've gotten wise to it, but not everybody has. Like a lot of people say, "Hey, it's a law for patriots. If you're opposed to it, you must be unpatriotic." And so I think she described, she really describes the game that the politicians play, the ignorance that they have, how they put what they want and their lust for power above what is and what will work. And we are seeing it play out. And what her heroes had in Atlas Shrugged was this citadel, if you will, right? This Galt's gulch, this place that they could hide, which they eventually all receded to and hid. And we may need to have citadels, but the one thing that she didn't envision was Bitcoin, that we would have some way of protecting ourselves from seizure, from I guess, and from regulation, from things that would cripple us. Now, we only have Bitcoin, and it may not be enough. And I think this is kind of the moment of truth, because there's still so much harm that government can do.
For me, I actually think in many ways, Gulch was the metaphor for Bitcoin, because, like, the way I saw it, the cover that they had with the sort of the refraction of the light is kind of in a sense like an encrypted, it's like the cryptography layer.
It's an encrypted wall of energy.
Yeah.
Right. Which is Michael Saylor's line. They had an encrypted wall of energy.
That's what Gulch was, in a sense. It was this sort of this place that was, invisible or outside of the existing, and the productive were able to opt out and go there and rebuild. And I just, for me, that analogy is so strong. Like, it's so absolutely deep, because that's, metaphysically speaking, that's what Bitcoin is. Well, it is the new promised land.
I really, as I say, I'm an optimist, and I'm very hopeful. And I've had lots of discussions with other objectivists who are also Bitcoiners, where we compare Galt's gulch and Bitcoin. And there's really interesting long discussions to be had about whether it can or can't be. I'm on your side, Alex. Like, I think Bitcoin's going to give us enough leverage, enough strength to break the backs to sufficiently break the back. Like, we're not after a utopia here, right? We're just after being able to live our fucking lives and not having crazy psychos tell us that they need to turn off the power, that our lives need to be sacrificed for the sake of some ideal that they have, right? That's all we're really after. And Bitcoin might be able to give us all of that. And that would be truly splendid if it did. I'm kind of losing. Oh, I was going to say, I shared with you a video of Nick Szabo, and you might want to put it in your show notes if you publish. Nick Szabo was once asked at a conference, I can't remember which one, where did you guys get the idea, you cypherpunks? And this is a great transition to the next thing that I want to discuss. Where did you cypherpunks get the idea for cryptocurrency, for Bitcoin, for Bitcoin, for all these? And he says, a lot of us read Atlas Shrugged, and there was this concept of a Galt's gulch, and we wanted to see if we could build a Galt's gulch out in the open. And it's just a quick 2-minute answer, but it is this connection to know that, I think for Bitcoiners who are listening to this, to know part of the inspiration for Bitcoin came out of what Ayn Rand saw as a defense for productive people from the regulatory state, from the suffocating state. So there's maybe some additional motivation, but I guess where I wanted this to take us as well is, I thought it would be interesting to draw some parallels between some of her characters and what they go through, and their philosophy, and what her heroes are versus her villains are, and the cypherpunks and the Bitcoiners, because there's just some, and maybe it's just a short conversation, but her heroes are builders. In The Fountainhead, her hero is an architect. Right? He wants to build. He wants to create things out of stone and granite and marble and steel and glass. He wants to be able to do that, and he confronts a world where he's told you shouldn't build according to your vision, you should build according to tradition. Nobody's going to want your crazy buildings, your crazy ideas. And he says, and they ask him, who's going to give you permission? And he says, I'm not asking for permission. And this again, right? I'll build for whoever wants me to build. And this again, to me, is very much like what's said in the Cypherpunk manifesto, right? It's not, Cypherpunks don't ask a government for permission to write software. They don't ask regulators for permission to write stuff. Cypherpunks write code. I mean, that's the credo. Cypherpunks write code. And this is what her heroes did, whether it's Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead, or you mentioned Hank Rearden, who creates a new kind of steel in Atlas Shrugged. These are people who just want to be left alone, to be creative, to build things that are useful for themselves and for other people, and not for everybody for the sake of everybody else, but because they love building these things, and there are people who love consuming the things that they've created and couldn't create these things on their own. So they value the existence of these people. They don't hate these people. And maybe I don't have as much to say about cypherpunks as I thought, but Ayn Rand's heroes are these are like the cypherpunks, right? They have a skill. They're engineers. They're technical. They use their mind to make working things in the real world, and they don't appeal to people's emotions or sympathies. Cypherpunks don't say, please run my code, I worked really hard on it. They say, here's code that works, right? And it's functional, and they don't do market, right? There's no marketing around Bitcoin, right? But Bitcoin's gotten to where it is without a nickel of marketing, right? Unlike so many other projects that have raised capital from venture capital and pre-funding and all these other things, and try to tell everybody you should run this because of a marketing campaign. Bitcoin stands out there to say, if you like it, run it. If it's good, run it. And this is kind of what you see. This is what you see in many of her characters. Like people say, oh, gee, Ayn Rand was the first who wrote characters who were on the autism spectrum, because look at how, how they weren't good at marketing their products, or how they just offered it to the world. But there's such a beauty to that, because when you market something, what are you trying to do? You're trying to communicate the pros without the cons. You're probably trying to exaggerate the pros. You're trying to conceal the cons. So you're lying. And so her characters were honest. And we call that some kind of deficiency in our, like, oh, this person is on the spectrum. They're deficient. They're deficient. They don't lie. It's a virtue, being honest with people. It's not a vice. It's not a deficiency. It's not a flaw. And that's what I kind of see as well in this Bitcoin community as well. If I go beyond the cypherpunks, right? There's raw people. There people who are developers, people who say, look, the code does this, right? Look, it functions, this thing functions in this way, it works. And I think of something that I'm amazed by, that I use as often as I can, which is like the Lightning Network. I'm blown away every time I use it. I know it only takes 2 seconds for a transaction, but I always have to talk for at least 5 minutes with the person I transacted with about how amazing it was that it only took 2 seconds. But there's no marketing campaign for the Lightning Network, really, right? There was a white paper that was written. There were developers who worked hard at it. There were challenges along the way. We needed a soft fork. We had to fight like fucking hell for SegWit to get activated. Like, there were enemies every step of the way, from getting from there to here. There are people who have things that don't work, that aren't decentralized or aren't scalable, who say, don't worry about that. That'll never come. Like, we can name the villains in the Bitcoin world who are enemies of Lightning Network, as an example, and yet it still works. It doesn't need, I'm not going to name any of the villains because I loathe them so much. I don't even want to say their name, but it doesn't need those people's blessings for it to work. It works because of reality. It works because it works in reality, because the numbers of math work in reality, because you can route payments, because because cryptography works. And so this is kind of the beauty of the connection in my mind. And I think why, like, I was able to fall into the Bitcoin rabbit hole really, really, really quickly. I read the white paper and I went out and bought Bitcoin. I didn't ask a whole lot. I saw in the white paper what I saw in Ayn Rand's Hero. So I'd already spent all this time, and then I needed to do a lot of learning to truly understand it. And as I said at the beginning, I put a lot of time into it. But I knew that there was something there that was like what Ayn Rand talked about. That Satoshi was a hero that could have been one of Ayn Rand's heroes, and that so many of the people in the community were going to be like characters in Ayn Rand's books, both the good and the evil. And it's what inspired, I spent a lot of time in 2017 when the fork war was growing. I wrote a lot of essays under a NIM at the time on Reddit, because that's where the community was. It was before Twitter, in favor of running the UASF client. And I know I convinced some people to run it and gave people the excitement, the energy and the belief that we could go up against the corrupt companies or the people who wanted to fork Bitcoin and sterilize it in a sense, but break it so that you couldn't actually run a full node eventually. And we succeeded. And it was like this great triumphant moment, like a moment when the John Galt line is built, for example, in Atlas Shrugged, right? The battles that we have to fight, people who believe in reality, people who want to fight for the principle of decentralization, because we know what it means to be subject to a regulatory body which has some human beings in charge of it. We're ready to fight really hard against that, and we're going to have opponents every step of the way, all kinds of opponents, all kinds of villains, corporate villains, people who are issuing competition and want to distract people, the marketers. Of course, the regulators are going to be there. I mean, Bitcoin's not particularly loved by central bankers or politicians, but it's still right. Like, it is real sound money in a digital world. The gold bugs are just another kind of example of people who are enemies of Bitcoin because they want something that no longer is. We haven't gone very deep into Ayn Rand's philosophy. I don't want people to think, oh, it's just these few little axioms and their consequences. Like, there's just such a beautiful thing that's built, and there are parts of her philosophy that are also very, very hard to understand. They take a lot of time. Just like Let's
go into those.
Sure.
Let's draw upon a couple.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe paint a broader picture of her philosophy. People are very moved by ethics and by the vision. Like, so what does her philosophy say the meaning of life is, in a sense? Because why not start at the very end, or why not start at the climax? Douglas Adams says it's 42. Many philosophers have a very wicked view of man, right? They think that man is a beast of some sort, a greedy, selfish, destructive beast that needs to be constrained in order to show any virtue. Ayn Rand sees man as a heroic being, a being capable, a being that has the capability of reason, of being able to use his consciousness to understand reality and to shape reality for his betterment. She sees the relationship between men who are free as having no conflict of interest between each other. But she talks about the trader principle, where men will voluntarily trade the best that they have to offer for the best that others have to offer, as opposed to, say, the communist slogan of from each to his ability, to each to his need. She points out that one man's need is no claim on another man's ability. And so we end up with this beautiful vision, and she paints this in her heroes. She says, not every man is a hero, right? Many men turn out to be these broken villains. And it's kind of, I think the Fountainhead's actually a great study in one of the supporting characters, not the hero, who has heroic potential and fails to live up to his heroic potential because he sells out. That's Gail Wine, and then another one who doesn't have the same, and not every man has the same potential, she points out, and she says that, you know, those who try to pretend that they're able to do what they're not in fact able to do also meet a tragic ending and cause tragedy for others. So it's amazing that the reality. So
Gale was such a disappointment for me in Fountainhead.
Yeah, he's a tragic character, right?
Really was.
Yeah, because here Gail Wine in the Fountainhead is this brilliant, competent, capable man who rose above adversity, but was a cynic in the process and didn't offer the best that he could to the world until he met the hero Howard Warwick, and by then it was too late for him. He'd already become a publisher. You know, he was in the media, right? And he was in the media that's projected exactly like today's media to twist the story, to tell the stories people wanted to hear, and sell out. And then when the time actually came, the true test, and he wanted to tell the truth, it was too late. He'd already conditioned his audience to the point where when he tried to tell the truth, they rejected him, and he ended up ousted from what he was. But a character with all that potential. And so, you know, again, Ayn Rand says every man has incredible potential if they apply it properly, and it is this tragedy potentially where if you don't make the best of yourself, if you don't live according to a sound philosophy, you will be the one responsible for ruining your life. You won't be able to play the victim card on others. And this is the moral of Gail Wine in the Fountainhead. He had such great potential, and he ended up just being a playboy, really, at the end of the day. He didn't get the fundamental satisfaction that life has to offer. And it's another, you know, people also accuse Ayn Rand of being all about big business and money. And here is a great example of a character that had all this money and ran a big business and was shown to be a tragic character who ended up suffering and ended up not achieving what they wanted to with their life because they sold out. So she's very much against selling
unfulfilled.
Right. So back to her philosophy. So she reaches this conclusion that man can be this incredible heroic being that can achieve great things, that can live a wonderful life. And she says to enjoy every aspect of life. There's a credo or an oath in Atlas Shrugged, which every man in the Gulch takes, which says, I swear by my life and my love of it, that I will never live my life for the sake of another man, nor ask him to live for mine. And it basically says, my life is the end of my life, right? It's the purpose of my life, is making my life as great as possible. And so is every other man's, right? It is immoral of me to ask some other man to sacrifice some aspect of his life so that mine may be better. Right? Which is the exact opposite of the communist credo in a sense, right? Which says that every man should give everything he can of himself to any man for whatever need he has. And it's quite fascinating how she actually integrates this with a whole philosophy that talks about metaphysics, which is reality is. And we pretty much covered a lot of Ayn Rand's metaphysics just in this existence, identity consciousness, and the primacy of existence over consciousness. So won't go a lot into that. It's not a very controversial or breakthrough theory of reality, but it's a part of objectivism. Her theory of epistemology is very breakthrough. And she is, I think, the first philosopher to have a really defensible theory of what concepts are. And you and I are talking to each other. Every word we use is a concept. Every word we use has a definition. It has a meaning. The definition doesn't cover the entirety of the meaning of the word. Like if I say computer, well, you know, we might come up with this let's go back to something that's less of a technical thing. We say man. Aristotle had a good definition of man. He said man is the rational animal. So there's a genus and a species, right? Man's an animal, so he's of the genus, and which type of animal is he? He's the one animal that has the faculty of rationality, which ended up being a pretty good definition. There's some jokes if you study ancient Greek philosophy, you know, that there are all these philosophers sitting around asking, what is man? And they come up, well, he is a hairless biped, right? And then another philosopher plucks a chicken and throws it over the fence, and it's walking around, and so they see another hairless biped. So they say, well, so is that a man? And so, Aristotle knew that definitions required understanding the essence of a thing, and he struggled with a bunch of other things about its natural form and words like what's intrinsic to it. Ayn Rand has this theory of concept, and I won't go into too much, but I just paid a little bit of credit where it's due. She says that a concept is all of the essentials of a particular concrete. Ideas can be concrete, but with all of its measurements omitted. So, for example, if we talk about a man, right, we could say he is a rational animal, but we're omitting all the other measurements, whether he's male or female, whether he's tall or short, whether he's bald or has lots of hair, whether he's muscular or weak. The concept of man as rational animal subsumes all those possibilities of all the men that will ever exist, right? The idea of the word man is all men, every man who ever exists should fit within the definition of it. And the way that our minds work is that they reduce these concepts to those essential characteristics with all the measurements omitted. So if we take a simpler concept like a table, a table is a flat surface supported by some kind of base. That's pretty much what and it's man-made. We could say it's a man-made piece of furniture that has a flat surface with a supporting base. And so we're not saying whether it has 4 legs or a tube in the middle. We're not saying whether it's made out of metal or whether it's made out of wood. And that way, when we use the word table, we can refer to any kind of table in the world. So there's this tremendous condensation. There's this tremendous reduction, right? Because I don't say to you, when I want to talk about man, I don't have to say, well, Alex and Francis and John and Paul and Ringo and Greg, and I can just say man, and I'm referring to all men, right? And I can even put a filter on it to identify it. And so she points out this is the reduction. So we have this idea in our head, and then we give it a sound, a word, and then we have a concept. And there's a whole lot more into how we come to understand what a concept is and how we define it and how we use it. But really, in the world of philosophy, before that, people were very confused, and I guess they still are, as to what concepts are. And so she offers this really interesting theory of what concepts are, and concepts can apply to, there's concepts of the mind, concepts of consciousness. There's a really interesting reading, and there's a book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, which kind of goes into this in detail for listeners who are interested in it. And then I move on. So her most controversial and famous aspect of her philosophy is her ethics. And she perhaps didn't use the most popular word to describe it, but her first book on ethics was called The Virtue of Selfishness. And the objectivist ethics is concretized in the book Atlas Shrugged, and that oath that I shared with you, that we recited here, is the dramatization of the objectivist ethics, right? That everyone should live for their own sake and not make anybody else live for anybody's sake but their own sake. And the justification for this comes from the fact that man is a rational animal. I'm just going to try to, I've only peppered a few things from her philosophy, but because everything's so beautifully integrated in her philosophy, I don't need to give the whole thing. So man is a rational animal with free will acting in reality. You know, I think I introduced free will there. I'm not going to prove that free will exists here, but man lives in the universe of reality where what is takes primacy over what he wants. And so he has to figure out what to do to survive. And we're not given meat, we're not given food, we're not given warmth, we're not given shelter, we're not given clean water, we're not given medicine. These are all the man-made things that man has to make. And man will only make these things if he can keep the fruits of his effort. If man is a slave where he is meant to work and then surrender what he has created to somebody else, he will not bother to work. The incentives simply are not there. Whereas if he's allowed to create what he can and trade and voluntarily trade with other men who created what they can, he's incentivized to create as much as he possibly can. And so this ultimately explains why we end up with a better civilization when men are free to produce what they can figure out to produce and trade it freely with other men. And so this is her ethics, the ethics that says men should take care of themselves, right? Should be responsible, should be rational. They need to be rational. They need to be responsible. They need to act in their interest to take care of themselves, and that there's no conflict. And this is her fear of politics, which leads her to saying that capitalism, free market capitalism, is the only moral social system because it's social system. And again, I know we've ended up with all these disastrous definitions of capitalism, but she would define it as a system where men are allowed to keep and freely trade what they create and what they own, and that the government is there to protect their property and protect their rights, rather than to redistribute wealth and tell them what they may or may not produce. And so I think to Bitcoiners, this sounds like a pretty sound philosophy of ethics and politics, but we see just how alien it is to everybody else who says, if you're not but what about the poor? You're not creating a social safety net for them, without considering the consequences of incentivizing people to not work, without considering the consequences of what you take away from the people who did do the work. Right? I live in Canada. We have what most people walk around thinking is free healthcare, which is anything but free. I mean, we pay huge taxes. We pay through taxes, and it's not a very good system. It's wonderful that you don't have to worry about paying when it's time to go and see a doctor, but you don't get the same quality of service that you do when a doctor is actually incentivized to provide a cure or a treatment for you. You get bureaucratized bureaucracies that push paper and write prescriptions and have less vested interest in the true health of the patient. And
it's just such a wasted. There's just so many resources that are wasted.
Right.
By adding the middleman in there,
yes.
who doesn't have any incentive to actually do it right anyway.
No, the middleman's incentive is to stay in power as the middleman, and potentially to have more middlemen work for them because they don't like their job so much. It's hard work. And so we end up, I think on WTF happened in 1971, that great site, there's a number of charts that show, like in schools, what's happened since 1971 is the number of teachers has hardly gone up, but the number of administrators has gone through the roof. And now administrators outnumber teachers 10 to 1. And the same thing with hospitals, right? The number of doctors and nurses has barely gone up, but the number of administrators has increased 100-fold. And we see the same thing with lawyers in our society. We just see the unproductive showing up and standing in the way of the productive. And there's a great scene in Atlas Shrugged, which is known as Francisco's money speech. So anyone who doesn't intend to read the books, just type in Francisco's money speech into Google or DuckDuckGo and read the speech because it's been repurposed. But there's a scene at a party where some some of these phony balonies all dressed up in their suits say money is the root of all all the looters and moochers. And one of these heroic characters delivers one of these classic Ayn Rand speeches about money. But he says, you know, when men who produce, I think I'm going to try to remember the exact quote, but I probably won't do it justice. When men who produce need to ask permission to produce from other men who produce nothing, then you know your civilization is doomed. Well, this is unfortunately, this is one of the most true things that we see, because it's an abstract statement, that we see in Atlas Shrugged, that we also see in our world today. All these grandstanding politicians, not even just the politicians, but these public figures in the media, the critics, the people who show up on media as experts, right? I make the air quotes with the experts because they're just people dressed up in bow ties and white smocks, and scientists.
It's the Robert Stadlers of the world. It's literally another archetype that she just nailed so perfectly.
Right. And these people, they produce nothing, but they tell people who do produce things whether or not they'll be permitted to produce them. And this is the great tragedy, because these people who do produce nothing and seem to think that they know what the producers should produce and how they should produce it and who they should produce it for, have no idea about what it is to produce a thing. For what I found so incredible, when I was reading Ayn Rand, I was working in a newspaper company, and it's probably a mistake in my career. I was working in the digital division, in the internet division of a company whose roots were not in the internet. The people who worked there were reasonably smart. They were quite experienced in the newspaper industry, but they had no idea what was coming at them in digital. They didn't understand that ads could rotate, that content could be personalized and customized in real time. They didn't understand that there were no variable costs and hardly any fixed costs in the internet. It was just a very different business. Eventually, I ended up having to spend more than half of my time in meetings with those people, with them telling me how they thought I should run the internet side of the business, because it was eating their lunch. And I felt like I was in an Ayn Rand novel. It's like, here are all these people who don't understand what's going on, telling the people who do understand what's going on how they should do it. I ultimately resigned when I'd had enough. I went to the gulch, like so many other producers. And of course, all of the digital businesses proceeded to collapse when they handed them to people who only knew how to run print businesses or, you know, analog businesses. And I don't need to make mine any kind of epic tale, but it's a concrete example that I witnessed firsthand of what I see happening all over the world at much, much larger scale when we tell energy producers how they, you know, when a politician with zero education in any science field, right? Like the prime minister of my country is a drama teacher, and he's deciding what pipelines will be built, right? What pipelines will be built, what pipelines won't be built, whether we'll have pipelines, what carbon taxes we should have, what shouldn't, how healthcare will be administered, where money will go. And he has no education in economics. Not that an economics education is anything I'd recommend to anybody, but he's way out of his depth, but he doesn't know it. And he doesn't have the humility, the humbleness to defer to not experts, but to the people doing the fucking job.
Yeah, to the ones doing it, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So what's I guess I've got a question around this, and you know, you're far more versed with Ayn Rand's, you know, objectivist philosophy. But does she have a idea or a theory, or does she allude to why there is a tendency for, you know, these kind of literal drama queens to, you know, want to play God? Like, why is there a tendency for people to want to become, whether it's looters or moochers,
Sure,
you know, or the cattle or the sheep, basically?
it's a great question. I'm going to answer on the spot, and I'm not going to say that this is that I know with certainty that this is what Ayn Rand would say. She's much more brilliant than I am. But as a student of hers, of her philosophy, I'd say there are all sorts of flaws that human beings have. And there's many different types of flaws, which is why she doesn't just have one villain in her books. She has to concretize her villains through all kinds of things. So there isn't one common thread that is exactly the same thing in all of her villains, except for that they ultimately evade reality, which is something that you mentioned earlier. They're not consistent with reality, right? A lot of what I see when we talk about these drama queens there are people who lust for power. There are people who lust for fame. There are people who lust for money. And there are people who want these things without doing what it takes to earn them in reality. Right? Like the person who invents a nuclear power plant, right? Or the team that builds a nuclear power plant, the SpaceX team, let's use SpaceX as a real world example. The people who actually figured out how to launch reusable rockets. These are the people who know how this thing works. These are the people who've earned the right to launch reusable rockets. Not some politician who got elected who's going to say, well, I want to regulate how much of some chemical they can use in the fuel for the rocket, or how often they can launch, or when they can launch, or where they should launch from and where they should land to. But these are all arbitrary claims of power from an unthinking individual who hasn't earned the right to say it. But you can see why some people would want to say these things, right? Especially if they want them to launch from their from the territory that they're the governor of, or if they want to supply it with fuel that's from some company that they own a stake in. And so there's all these corrupted reasons why people impose themselves on other people's free will and try to get people who have the right judgment and should have the right to choose, to get them to choose otherwise, or to force them from choosing what their free will would get them to choose. And I think you can look at, as a Bitcoiner, we tend to look at incentives a lot of the time. And I think you can always see that there are incentives. I just want to say, not all the incentives aren't always about money. I mean, the incentives are often about power, they're about fame, they're about self-acceptance, they're about appearances. And so, there's more to money. There's more than money to the world and to what drives people. But ultimately, people seek the unearned, right? They seek the reward. They seek rewards without being prepared to earn them. And I think that's what turns someone into a villain. And so, in saying that, I'm gonna say two things to a listener who might take this. It's, don't try to get the virtuous things of the unearned. And the flip side of that coin is also, do not accept guilt that you haven't earned. If you're doing something good, and we see this happen to Ayn Rand's heroes all the time, is they are guilted by their family, the politicians, the unemployed, the competitors, the media. They're guilted into saying you're terrible. You have too much market share. You charge too high a price for what you do. You're not thinking about everybody else. You're not thinking about what's fair. And
you're not putting others before you.
Yeah, and they're trying to put a guilt on you, and you haven't done anything to deserve that guilt. Okay, like you've done nothing. You've done nothing wrong. And in my life, I think this is one of the most tragic things that I've seen. I've personally absorbed a lot of unearned guilt in previous states in my life, but I've seen lots of really, really good people accept this unearned guilt. And I don't know if he was ever really a good guy, but I think there was this transformation. I don't think he was a bad guy, perhaps in the early days, but you take a look at Bill Gates and you go back, and he became the world's richest man by having a vision to put a computer running his software on every desk in the world, at a time when nobody thought anybody would need computers. It was maybe not all very good software, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But he became the world's richest man, and regulators started to come against him, and everybody told him how evil he was for being the world's richest man, and it turned him into some kind of Ayn Rand villain, sort of, from being an Ayn Rand hero. And he's dedicated his life now to being an altruist and to doing these seemingly good things in charity, right? To doing the things that the guilt pushing morality of the world would transform someone like him into. And now with his ambition, we hear crazy things coming out about him. I don't know to what extent they're true or not, but he's trying to use his world-changing powers to enforce worldwide vaccination or change the climate all by himself and all this stuff. And it's maybe tragic in a sense, but it's maybe the most vivid example in the world of someone who was a producer, who accepted all this unearned guilt, and now has become this massive altruist who is getting in the way of many of our lives and not letting us just live our lives, right? I used to have a choice.
That's a really good example, particularly with the Bill Gates thing. It's like, because I think, many people just sort of write him off as, a super villain or all this sort of stuff. But I think that's a very good analysis on, because, that article that I wrote recently, the Utopian Dystopias one, where I sort of try and make a case for, the path to hell being, paved with good intentions, where this desire for a utopia is actually what leads us to a dystopia, because we're, blind enough to believe that we can somehow, bend reality to our will, which kind of fits inside the subjectivist philosophy here. It's like, the consciousness being subservient to existence.
Right. Yeah.
And
if you do study your article was fantastic, by the way. It's so great to be in a community of people who can write such good articles. I don't know what else to say. Like, it's really superb.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Go on.
I would say I've just kind of salt and peppered you with a little bit of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and it really is a thing to behold, because it so well corresponds to reality that when you have the tools of the philosophy available to you, you're able to do exactly what you were just doing, which is to integrate them all and connect them all to reality and say, yeah, this is an example of someone trying to assert the primacy of consciousness over existence, or this is an example of somebody trying to ask somebody to live, to refute one man's ability to use his free will, or this is someone failing to correctly conceptualize in reality. This is someone being unvirtuous, or being vicious. It's interesting, virtue and vice are seen as these two opposite words. Someone who has virtue is virtuous. Someone who has vices is vicious. We tend not to often connect those two words, but where do vicious people, where do wicked people come from? They have rejected the virtues, and Ayn Rand has a really nice section on virtues, or Leonard Peikoff in his book of her philosophy has a really nice section on what, not the only virtues, but what objectivists would see as the primary virtues. And they're not generosity, right? They're not self-sacrifice. These are not objectivist virtues. I'm going to reach for the book, so I don't, right? But their reason, their independence, their individuality. Let me find them. I'm sure I'll find them here in my table of context if I grab the right book, actually.
Yeah, flick through them. I was just going to mention in the meantime, one of the other things you mentioned there, like, I used to have a saying, which is the entitlement is the root of all evil. And I think you mentioned it earlier when you were discussing, what it is that pushes people down the path. But I think, the adding some color to it there is like sort of entitlement being the root of all evil, I think, more fits with the moocher type persona. Whereas altruism may actually be, or misguided altruism may be the root of all evil for looters, because they're in a position where, they're not sort of, yes, entitlement is still there, but it's like, or maybe it's just a different flavor of entitlement where they believe they're entitled to mandate or dictate what it is that others should feel or experience.
Yeah. And what is entitlement when we take the word apart? It says, I want something for nothing, right? It's like, I want, right? And this is again, well, so who's going to give you the something and get nothing in return? And why is that fair, right? And so we see this increasing spiral of rationalizations of why people should get something for nothing. And at the end of the day, it's this floating theory in the air that's not grounded in reality. Let me go back and state what the objectivist virtues are. So the first is independence, right? Which says you need to think for yourself. You need to act for yourself. You shouldn't rely on others. You shouldn't act entitled. We'll just use what you just said. You shouldn't act entitled to the work of others. You need to be independent. The second is integrity and loyalty to rational principles. So I think many of us know what integrity is. It's consistency. It's adherence to reality. So being rational. Honesty as the rejection of unreality. And so honesty to yourself, right? This isn't just about telling the truth to other people. And I'll have a comment on that too. But it's about accepting the truth yourself, right? And there's a lot of difficult truths out there. Like that your consciousness doesn't change the shape of reality as kind of a high level one. And you can't just get whatever you want, and that you have to work hard, and it's hard to invent, and there's competition, all these things. You have to be true to yourself. Honesty in the objectivist sense, it's a little bit different from honesty as Immanuel Kant would say. Right? Immanuel Kant says, one of these words at the tip of my tongue, categorical imperatives is honesty. And so that means you must always tell the truth. But in being true to reality, you really know that you need to lie to some people some of the time, right? Like the axe murderer, the child axe murderer comes to your door and knocks on the door and says, "Are there any kids in the house?" You shouldn't tell him the truth and say yes. You should lie to him and tell him, "No, go away." Or the thief or the tax collector comes to your house and says, "Do you have any money?" You should tell them, "I lost it in a boating accident." So that's honesty. Justice as rationality in the evaluation of men. So there's this principle of justice, right? Which is if somebody wrongs somebody else, they need to make good. That's this principle of justice. I'm not going to be able to get into these things. They're really detailed. Productiveness. Right? This is as opposed to feeling entitled, you should be productive. That's where your wealth comes from. It comes from what you produce, not from what you beg of others or steal from others. So the difference between producers versus the looters and the moochers. And pride as moral ambitiousness. Ayn Rand says that what's considered a vice in religious circles, the vice of pride, is actually a virtue. You should be able to feel pride if you've been independent, productive, virtuous, right? And it's a natural feeling, right? Like if you've ever accomplished something great, it is a proper moral feeling to feel good that you did something good. You shouldn't feel shame. And this is, again, the comparison to the unearned guilt. You should not feel guilty that you scored 100% on a test while other people who didn't study as hard and didn't have the natural inclination only scored 60% or something else. This is not a source of your guilt. This is a source of your pride. And you should continue to be your wonderful self, be your best self that you possibly can, be the hero that you have the potential to be.
Very beautiful, very beautiful. Does she have an expose similar to that on Vice? Or like a list of like similar on Vice?
There's a really good lecture series that her pupil Leonard Peikoff gave, and I'm trying to remember which one. He gave so many good courses, and I would highly recommend anybody listen to them. There's give me just a minute to think. You might want to edit out all this thinking.
That's okay.
Ayn Rand had this series of, she used to, after she published Atlas Shrugged, she used to get invited every year to speak at this event called the Fort Hall Forum. And she gave some really, really wonderful speeches there. And I think that there were some that may have related to wickedness. And let me just quickly search for a couple.
Yeah, go for it. I think the idea of like those virtues and how important they are, and like the when you think about orienting yourself as a human
Mm-hmm.
being, and like and
Mm-hmm.
the principles that define what it means, to be a virtuous human being, and sort of like the emotional attraction we have to that, like when you watch like a Braveheart, for example. Like I remember every time I've ever watched the movie Braveheart, like it's always brought a fucking tear to my eye. It's always moved me internally, because
Yeah.
just like those virtues are like wired into people, and I
Yeah.
think when you've denied them for so long, like it creates like an emptiness in the soul almost. And like I did that post on Twitter today with that crazy World Economic Forum lady from
Oh
Denmark,
God.
who just like,
Yeah.
you
You will
look at her
own
eyes and
nothing and
it's
have
like,
no privacy.
and I mean, it's like holy fucking shit. I
Yeah.
honestly thought that was a Photoshop when I first saw it until I
Yeah. Me
clicked it and
too.
I realized
Me
it was
too.
real.
I shared it with friends and I said, this is not a satire account, because I couldn't believe it.
But like that's just it sort of goes to show of like when when you don't embody virtue, like you look at her,
Mm-hmm.
that thing, whatever it is, that automaton is like completely empty in the eyes. Like it's just
Mm-hmm.
like a fucking voidless void
Right.
staring at that thing. It's like it's scary,
Yes.
man.
Yeah. No. Like it's people not wanting it. What are someone who actually says, and I mean, we can't get into that person's head because there was so little in that content, but someone who actually reaches a conclusion that they want to own nothing and have no privacy and probably do nothing, and that will make them perfectly happy. What evasion is that, right? Like if we
Mm,
talk, so Ayn Rand's greatest sin, and now you've got my mind going, right? So her highest virtue is rationality, right? And so the greatest sin is evasion, because that is the greatest vice is evasion, because it's avoiding reality, right? And any man can choose to evade reality, but not the consequences of evading reality. Now that I'm warmed up, I can say these things. So,
good.
so evasion is the word. And what this woman doing in this tweet is saying is she's evading her humanity. She's
Mm,
evading the fact that a human being is not a plant, right? She wants to be like rooted in the ground, and the sun shines and the rain falls. And if the sun shines and the rain falls, then she lives. And if it doesn't, then she accepts that that's her demise. But that's not what a human being is. A human being fights to live. A human being is an animal that finds what it needs to live and uses its mind. Right? This is one of the big the theme of Atlas Shrugged is man's mind is his means of
mm,
survival. Right? And without, if we do not use our minds, we die, because we don't have, we're not fast. We don't have sharp claws or sharp teeth. We don't live by, through natural easy predation. We invent tools to help us hunt. We invent fire. We discover and tame fire so we can stay warm. We build shelter, and we take it to the point where we can build rocket ships. Right, this is the potential of our rationality. So anyone who doesn't want to think and act in accordance with what they can honestly understand is someone living a vicious life, a life of vice rather than a life of virtue. And we see a lot of that in our society, right? People who just don't want to be bothered with understanding things. And our education system lets people say, I'll take a C, I'll take a 60, right? I don't want to learn, like, you don't have to learn math, but you will be relegated to work that doesn't involve math. You don't have to learn how to code a computer, but you will be relegated to work that doesn't involve instructing a computer. And that's fine. There's plenty of good work for people to do out there that doesn't require these things. But if you learn nothing and then you preach to be the prime minister of a country, and tell everybody what else to do, you're vicious.
just on that, another reference to Atlas Shrugged is what was the name of the daughter of the car manufacturer who became like she was the one who instituted you know, the rules inside the manufacturing plant for, you know, from
Oh
each
God, yes, the
of their ability
Starnes.
to,
This I
yeah,
remember the
that's it.
last name Starnes, and
Yeah,
it's a
so there was
20th Century Motor
Jetsons.
Company.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I'm embarrassed to say I've forgotten the name of one of these short villainous characters who instituted socialist policies in the factory and ultimately led to its collapse. What did you want to say
Well,
about her?
well, I mean,
Ned.
remember the description. Remember the description that is given of her by
Mm-hmm.
Rand. You know,
Mm-hmm.
is actually the you know, that soulless, empty.
Yes.
You know, those eyes that
Yeah.
just don't have any life or any spark in them anymore. And it just,
Yeah.
while we were talking about this, it actually reminds me of that clip again of
Right.
this this lady
Yeah.
standing there saying, "You'll own nothing, have no privacy, and supposedly
Be
be
happy.
like." If that's the bar, if that's the you know, if that's the definition of happiness, it's like
Mm-hmm.
I don't want anything to do with that. It's
Right.
just, but
Be
Rand's ability
prepared. Like,
to have
yeah.
to have
Looking at that
seen that.
woman. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. You finish.
No, I was just going to say, Rand's ability to have sort of articulated that in a book, you know, as a character, and, you know, sort of us
Mm-hmm.
seeing that in real life. No, it just
Yeah.
brings chills.
Yes. It is. I mean, this is really the power of her fiction writing, right? That she'd had all this philosophy and said, I need to now concretize this idea in dramatic fashion in my novel. And to do that, she had to come up with a scenario, right? Like the story of the 20th Century Motor Company in Atlas Shrugged. And she had to create characters, and she had to bring the characters to life. And here we were talking about, her critics say her characters are two-dimensional, and yet you remember the descriptions of the eyes of this villainous character, and the kinds of things that she said, because somehow Ayn Rand had this gift of bringing these characters to life with the proper name, the proper physical description, and the proper description of their mannerisms, as well as their dialogue, so that you got a feeling, which is, one of the, if we were to talk about Ayn Rand and art, she says every human being has a sense of life that they project, whether it's beautiful or wicked or this or that or the other, that you can quickly form an opinion of another human being, within the first few seconds of meeting them, and just in the way that they carry and project themselves. And that this is something to do with aesthetics and art as well. But she was able to create these characters that just come through so vividly, right? You talked at the outset about some of the heroes that you were attached to, but I don't mean to change the subject on you. I think if we were to actually have a philosophical discussion about this woman who said that she will own nothing, have no privacy, and be happy, we're going to find terror, either in her mind or in our contemplation of what it is that she thinks. It's a terrifying premise that you will have nothing, not even your privacy, right? It's like being forced to be paraded naked out in front of all the other people in the world and have no possessions. It's the image of slavery in my mind. And to say that is good. Now, maybe she has no intention of encountering that herself, and she's trying to somehow trick somebody into thinking, oh, that sounds good. I don't have to have the responsibility of owning anything, and I don't have to have the responsibility of not being watched all the time by somebody who's going to do what's good for me. But it's incredibly naive, and it's incredibly inhuman. It's just not a human thing to seek, right? We all look for our privacy. We all want to do things that we don't want to tell other people about because we're discovering. It's not even that we're ashamed of these things. It's they are for us. They are ours. They are our private experiences just as much as we have our private property. And so privacy, having no privacy is not, like privacy and private property, they both have the word private in them for the same reason, because there's something that's ours and we don't want to take it away. So you're going to get me started on privacy, and then I'm going to take another 3 hours on the podcast. So So we won't go there right now, and it won't be about objectivism. But
I want to touch on one last thing there, and then I want to
Sure.
throw it over to you because I think you might have found those vices in the book. But the thing you mentioned about terror there as well, I think, is another great example of Ayn Rand's foresight and capacity to build these nuances into the characters. Is like when you see, the Stan's daughter, she fucking freaks out when Dagny's looking at her.
Right.
Jim at the end
Jim
of it
loses
freaks the fuck out, and he loses it. Stadler as well loses it. Like they all absolutely lose it.
Right. So, and we see this, right? We've seen it called something derangement syndrome. And Ayn Rand has 3 people suffer from something from like Dagny derangement syndrome in Atlas Shrugged. Dagny being the female heroine who we haven't even mentioned yet by name in this interview. And like you can see it all over Twitter, right? You can see people whose philosophy has driven them to derangement, right? They need everybody to wear a mask, or they need everybody to surrender something or other, right? And they're just freaking out in their cars, holding their iPhones, losing it, suffering this deranged episode. And that is the consequence of having a really bad philosophy, right?
It really is. Do you know who's a great example of that actually? Is fucking Taleb. Taleb is, I think, he is the Robert Stadler archetype, like someone who's showed
certainly
so
becoming
much.
one, yeah.
He really has. He's become a complete maniac, like who's lost his mind. And he honestly, listening to him on that latest, CNBC thing.
Yeah, I saw that.
About
olive oil.
Yeah, and he sounds like a Robert Stadler. He sounds like he's just completely fucking gone off the deep end. And is just like
deranged,
so contrary and deranged, exactly compared to his his writings.
I used to say
stuff.
And so it is a perfect example of the Robert Stadler character, the man of intellect who betrays the intellect for some corrupt end that he's pursuing. We haven't really seen what exactly it is that Taleb is after. Like when he first denounced Bitcoiners and Cypherpunks, I thought, oh, he's about to accept, because I'd read Atlas Shrugged, I guess, he's about to accept a government appointment of some sort, right? Like that's what I expected was coming next. It seems like he just went deranged on us and left. But it was also very clear that not only did he not read Cypherpunks' book, I don't think he read his own books, right? My mind is left perplexed, or he's become detached from the material that's in his own books. Because I used to hold him in very high regard. I used to say, someday he will be a famous philosopher, a minor philosopher, not like Ayn Rand, but an important contributor because of Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. I thought, but maybe I read more into those things than he actually had put in there. Maybe I was projecting. I don't know. Maybe he didn't write them.
Maybe like he's one of the greatest disappointments for me. For the last, when I think about who has disappointed me in the last 12 months more than anybody else, it's probably him, because like I held his position in such high regard. Like for me, Anti-Fragile and Black Swan were great, but for me, Skin in the Game was like the most powerful book that I'd read from him, and particularly just the notion of there's a piece I'm writing now, and in there I talk about how Bitcoin is the only true equality of opportunity we'll ever have. And the reason it is because it enables social mobility, which is something that we've never really had. Like we still live in a feudal system today, and we've always actually lived in a class and feudal system. And I think humanity will always have a feudal system, but what capitalism changes, or what objectivism, or what Bitcoin fundamentally practically changes, not just in theory, is the social mobility inside that feudal strata. Like that you can actually climb, but you can actually fall. And for me, Taleb like really articulated that so well in Skin in the Game, which is, you know, when you have skin in the game,
Yeah.
the system cannot rot because, you know, the top and the bottom can rotate.
Right. Right.
And that creates sort of like a dynamic equilibrium or a dynamic inequality. And for me, like that was just such a profound, you know, set of concepts, and just he articulated it so well. And to see him sort of fucking completely lose his mind and turn into, you know, King Soy is just like, it's super disappointing. But anyway, that's a
so no, but get ready. This happens in real life. Like, human beings have free will, and so they can make great choices and they can make shitty ones. And you know, Skin in the Game is actually very similar to the concept we were talking about before, about men having the right to make their own choices about their own property, right? And this is the whole. This is just it's another lens on having skin in the game. It's like, you should be able to decide what you want to do with what you've created. That's the very essence of skin in the game. And politicians who have no skin in the game should not be able to decide how to dispose of what you have created. And so that's the kind of the Objectivist's quick summary of the value of that book. I know it's an excellent book, and it covers so many great examples of it. But that's kind of staying on the topic of objectivism, what we would say about it. I know you wanted to go back to the objectivist vices, and I don't know that much is coming to me. I will say, you know, we talked about evasion one. I'd say the other one that's kind of, you know, so evasion would be the first and worst, but the other one is envy. And you were asking what drives some of these people to be so vicious, and the answer is envy. You know, and you see that, you do see the envious characters, or the envy driving many of the villains in her books. People who are simply jealous of the producers, right? Jim Taggart is always screaming at his sister and Hank, right? Like, it's so easy for you, he says, right? It's not easy for the rest of us. And so that drives him, that rationalizes for him, that defends for him in his mind why he can take the product of their work, because it's easy for them. It's not easy for him, so he should be entitled. And Ayn Rand has one of these essays about evil that anyone can read, called The Age of Envy. And I think if you read it today, I haven't refreshed myself on it all that lately, but boy, I think it would ring way too true for what's going on today, because it talks about, you know, living in a world driven by envy, by people who lust after what others have rather than know what it is that they want and they can make.
It's terrifying. It's
yeah.
Do you think so? So the next question I've got is do you think, you know, affluence brings this, you know, sort of upon society? So this kind of ties into the, you know, the seasons, you know, or like either the fourth turning or the strong men, you know, good times, weak men, etc. It's like another good model. Alan Farrington wrote a little article called Lenz's Law of Capitalism, where sort of, you know, capitalism and, you know, prosperity build wealth, but you know, it's sort of like this counteracting force of, you know, wealth and affluence breed these fucking riches and looters.
I'll say this. I don't think that these are natural necessities. I don't think that they're deterministic phenomenon. These cycles of fourth turning type things, or good men leading to good times leading to weak men leading to bad times leading to good men. I don't think that they're necessities. They are somewhat observable in history. I read the fourth turning. I wasn't completely persuaded by it, but they're not necessities, right? Like, if you are raised in good times, you don't have to be a weak man. Good times with a proper philosophy will make a good man out of a person who has a good philosophy, who doesn't get lazy, who doesn't act entitled, who acknowledges that reality exists and that we need to continue to advance. Our civilization doesn't steal from the productive. It's each person becomes productive in their own way. That's trajectory, right? Like that to me is, Elon Musk isn't perfect, but here he is. He's got a vision that we got to get off this planet. We got to get a city on the moon. We got to get a city on Mars. And he's working towards it. And it doesn't matter whether these are good times or bad times. He's detached from that. He's attached to his philosophy, his vision, his dream, and reality. And like, what's it actually going to take to get to, not just sit there in your backyard and stare at another planet. It's like, launch a rocket every few weeks so that you can learn more and learn more and learn more from this thing. So I don't think we're necessarily, I think for sure, I hold this with like 100% conviction. The introduction of fiat money and departure from the gold standard created so many perverse incentives, so much corruption, that it redirected the best of human energy away from the best of productivity, right? The game became getting access to the money spigot, not earning money by producing valuable things for other people, right? And so the fiat era needs to come to an end for us to truly, we've only got one Elon Musk now. If we didn't have fiat money, we'd have thousands of Elon Musks, right? Our civilization would be so much better. And not just in space travel and electric cars, but like in every single discipline. And we would have successful companies producing clean energy, not all these bureaucratized, men with pull companies saying that they'll produce green energy, but just like the Orrin Boyles of Atlas Shrugged, not actually producing much at all, just expensive boondoggles. Like, I think, and so I think that the fiat system is irredeemable. It's corrupt by its very construct. And that's why we're seeing the problems that we're seeing. We're seeing them 50 years after it was implemented, because that's how long it takes to take apart a great society. But if we don't get rid of it, it's not like we're going to have good times coming out after some fourth turning. If the fiat system stays, we're going to continue to sink into darker and darker and darker ages. And if we manage to get rid of the fiat system, hopefully with a Bitcoin standard, then we'll be able to see the best that man has to offer. And I want to see it happen sooner rather than later. I'm going to be 51 in a few days. So I've got a few decades left, probably only a couple in good health. I really want to see it happen sooner rather than later. And I want to be a part of it. And so I do feel like being a part of Bitcoin is, if not actually living in that world, working to create that world. And Ayn Rand, maybe I'll kind of wrap up on this. Ayn Rand has some saying that goes roughly like, those who work for a greater future tomorrow live in it today, and I do think that is somewhat experienced, because I can project on what the world can be in the future, and it's an amazing world if we all have good philosophy and good money.
That is a profound comment to wrap up on, but I'm not going to wrap up because I want to pull on that just a little bit longer.
All right. I was really building up to that being the finish. If I have to top that.
Oh God. Well, all I was going to do is just add some, maybe just some color to the comment about the fourth turning. Like, I actually, my feeling on that book, and I've kind of been a little vocal about this, like I loved Sovereign Individual. I hated the fourth turning. I thought the fourth turning was fucking garbage. I think the only thing that I managed to pull from that was the nature of seasonality in society. And I think one thing that they probably did have accurate is the and look, I think fiat is a magnifier for this, but I think it happens anyways. Just growing up slightly more sheltered, and then this is, maybe more Jordan Peter-esque, is, this idea of being, the walls protect you sort of become the walls that imprison you, and in many ways, weaken you and shelter you, and sort of you get to the point where you don't know what the wall is protecting you from, and you don't even know that it's a wall in the first place. So you sort of have this tendency to want to tear it down, because you don't appreciate, or you've forgotten what was on the other side in the first place. And it's sort of, I feel like that tendency to corrupt, I don't know if corrupt is the right word, but to sort of to grow up sheltered, and to not have an appreciation for what it took to build something. I think that is a cyclical thing, but for me, what gives me hope about Bitcoin is that the system itself is immune to that, which I believe is where I fundamentally and vehemently believe Bitcoin is the tool that gets us through the great filter. So I think all prior civilizations, had there been other ones in other universes or galaxies or whatever the fuck it is, have all failed because they lacked Bitcoin. Because what will happen is they'll continue this cycle of weak men, bad times, until they get technologically advanced enough to blow themselves up or turn into a dystopian nightmare, which transforms the living race into a bunch of deadbeat automatons. So I actually think without Bitcoin, the world does end. Like, because these cycles of weak men, strong men, blah 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 continue. But in the presence of Bitcoin, that seasonality is dampened on the downside, because that natural tendency towards entitlement and weakness and whatever cannot actually break the system itself. So that would be my sort of 2 cents on it.
I mean, I would love to have a whole other discussion with you, perhaps, on that, because I think I have thoughts on this which are in violent agreement with yours, but I think that they depart from what objectivism would have to say about these things, and they more enter the realm of science fiction and this potential. Because I too am such an optimist about Bitcoin. I think it is. Not so much. I don't want to disagree with your comment about the great filter. It's the great catapult, and I see it as this technology that's arrived here that's going to get us to figure out how to master energy. It creates an incentive to master energy, and when we do master energy, then we can do anything. Right? Like and we can do incredible things. I've decided to become a writer because I don't want to go back to the world of business. And so I did this series of nonfiction articles about Bitcoin, but I have a couple of big stories in me, and one is going to be this great science fiction story about what we can do over millions of years. And
cannot
Bitcoin
wait
figures into that. Yeah.
I cannot wait.
Right.
I cannot wait. That's the one thing, like, because I'm a, in the last year, I've been doing a whole lot of science fiction. Like my favorite to date is still Hyperion. Like I just love what Dan Simmons did.
I remember that. I read that so many years ago. I was probably your age when I read it. How old are you now?
30. Geez.
Oh, I was younger. I was in my 20s. I was still in university when I read the Hyperion books. But I was thinking about them now. The piece of writing I just shared with you today has time travel in it, which Hyperion has as well. Hyperion's the one with the shrike, right?
Correct. Yeah, the track. Yeah. And you should pick it up again. Like it's one of, like, for me, it's my favorite bit of science fiction. But like one of the things that disillusions me when I'm reading science fiction, like, and I've read a bunch over the last 12 months in particular, is the lack of sort of a grasp on what the future would technically look like. Because I actually don't think we become a spacefaring species again.
Right.
Again, in the atom, that does happen. We fucking blow it up beforehand. But with Bitcoin, we do that, and then the prerogative or the the reality of Bitcoin will break the nation state. Like there's one book that I'm reading now. I actually don't really like it too much, but sort of like about these, a future world where, virtual reality met nanotechnology, and you've got these sort of fighters that are that are part of the military and things like that. But just sort of this idea of a large scale, US military type institution existing in the future. It's like, no, man, that just doesn't fucking happen. That's not what it looks like. Like Bitcoin changes the fundamental incentives for large scale institutions like that, or governance systems like that, to function. Like that is not what a realistic sci-fi future will be.
I think Bitcoin ends up aligning property holders with their property creators, producers with their property rights, right? I think its unseizability, its transportability, maybe even just only those two things make it hard for the looters to in the long term loot. Like the Bitcoins move, and the people who own them move, and they disappear, and so the looters are left empty-handed, and they, as the sovereign individual suggests, they have to create pandemics to get people to not move around and take their money with them. But we're like, I think we're in for an age of glorious science fiction once more, because we can escape. Like, so it's interesting to watch science fiction, right? Science fiction that was written before the fiat standard kicked in, or shortly afterwards, before it hadn't corrupted all of society, was this beautiful genre of tremendous imaginings of visiting the ring world that was built, and Arthur C. Clarke with visitation from intelligent alien species to admire our glory and learn everything amazing that man had, or traveling to Mars and other planets, exploration, Star Trek, right? It was just this really amazing thing, and then it became this dystopian cypherpunk thing after 1971. Now, maybe some of that had to do with, we saw the dark side of what technology could do, but I think it was also, we lost our, after we landed on the moon, we didn't really see what to do next, and we landed on the moon like literally 2 years before the fiat standard kicked in, and we haven't been back since. And I just don't think these things are coincidences, right? I think we really hit the nail on the head, and I'm super grateful. When you read the short story that I sent you, you'll see just how grateful I am for Satoshi. The invention is a heroic, extraordinary achievement, and and I, like you, I think it's going to change the world for the better forever. So I don't want to understate the case for Bitcoin, and so I'm not in Bitcoin for the money. I'm in it for the world-changing technology, because we need money, right? It's not a mutually exclusive thing. We need money to coordinate human activity and incentivize rationality and productivity. Just to bring it back to objectivism. So, okay, that's the best I can do.
Is there anything else, any final bits and pieces you want to mention on objectivism?
You know what, I think this has been a really good discussion. I maybe just summarize by saying objectivism is this really deep and beautiful philosophy that will blow your mind over and over again, just like Bitcoin's blowing your mind. And it's not contradictory to Bitcoin, although there are many people who claim to be objectivists who aren't persuaded by Bitcoin. Fuck them, right? Objectivism tells you to think for yourself. So, you're not part of some cult. And maybe you can engage in some interesting dialogue with them. I've managed to turn a few objectivists into Bitcoiners. I was turned into a Bitcoiner by an objectivist who was a Bitcoiner. But it is a beautiful philosophy, and I really, really encourage people to study it. And I'd say it's very, very compatible with all the things that make you love Bitcoin will be things that are validated through objectivism. So you can have an even deeper conviction behind why Bitcoin come into this great invention that you and I think is going to change the world.
Nice. And then in terms of materials and resources, people should start with Fountainhead, move to Atlas Shrugged.
Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. There's
all the peripheral
stuff. There's lots of amazing lectures. I know people love to listen nowadays. So there's of course audiobook versions of these things, but even in the early days, Ayn Rand did these public lectures called the Ford. So if you search for Ayn Rand Ford Hall Forum lectures or Ford Hall Forum series, you will find both written versions of things, but you'll be able to listen to recordings of them. It's really interesting to hear her speak with her passion. She has this thick Russian accent, but she's got such passion and so smart. So it's wonderful to listen to her. Leonard Peikoff, who I mentioned, who was her student, Peikoff. Actually, if you go to the site peikoff.com, he did a podcast before podcasts were popular. And what he did was he actually applied Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism to everyday issues that people sent in as questions. So it was like an advice show. He reads the question and provides the answers. And there's a catalog of them now. He stopped doing it a number of years ago. He retired. But they're really amazing. And what you see is like so many philosophies are so bad at answering people's everyday questions. But objectivism isn't, because it's a philosophy for living in the real world, which is again one of these things that Ayn Rand said when asked to describe what objectivism is. And so if you go to peikoff.com, you can listen to some really good stuff. There's for free, the Ayn Rand Institute, I think offers an app and all these free downloads of all of these courses that Leonard Peikoff gave about objectivism. They're tremendous. The first one is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, I think it's called, or that's certainly what he named the book that he wrote out of it. There's an original course from 1970. This leads into one called Understanding Objectivism, which is a really, really deep philosophical course for people who want it. And there's a really interesting course for people who are interested in how physics and philosophy come together that he taught, and that's called Induction in Physics and Philosophy. There's so many. So you can browse the catalog. Like they really created a banquet of enormous material out there. And I look, Alex, you're one of these contributors to the banquet of Bitcoin content that's out there. That's so nice, and we see so many good writers. And we are many of the Bitcoiners, I'd say, are discovering philosophy as they write. And we're like students of philosophy. We're young. I dare describe myself as young. And I think the more that students of Bitcoin and the writers of Bitcoin, the influencers of Bitcoin, study Ayn Rand's philosophy, I think the more interesting things they'll find there. And they'll make their own decisions about what they want to accept or not accept, because they'll apply the virtue of rationality and honesty, and whatever they choose to accept, they'll be able to integrate into their writing. They'll find some really interesting things. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. I could not agree more. I think the principles and the ideas just align so well. So I think there's a lot of a libertarian Austrian economics sort of push in, there's that sort of energy in the Bitcoin space. But I think the Ayn Randian objectivists, sort of the deeper, because everyone sort of talks about the gulch, but sort of I feel like there's a lack of people who've actually sort of read deeper into it. So I hope that this discussion inspires people to actually dig.
Yeah, I would really invite thoughtful people who label themselves as libertarians to read Ayn Rand, because she would be the person who has a philosophy that gives teeth to the ideals of libertarianism. Like, sure, you feel like you should have rights, but why? What's your defense of it, other than that you feel it because your feelings don't matter? Ayn Rand really gives teeth to these ideas, right? From the very nature of existence and the very nature of man to why our rights are important. I've tried to give a very cursory explanation over here in this podcast, but she's got so many beautiful essays about this. So I would welcome anyone to dig deep.
We should actually, on that note, did you ever hear the the episode with myself and Stefan Kinsella?
I don't think so, no.
We did one on, okay, so we did one on sort of like anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism, and Kinsella's a brilliant mind, and we sort of brought up, because his original inspiration was actually Ayn Rand, and we brought up Ayn Rand a little bit, sort of discussed where some of her positions sort of veered off from, you know, the libertarianism, and sort of there was some inconsistencies around some of her ideas. About particularly intellectual property and stuff like that. But what might be actually a good idea, because I want to do a round two with him as well. Maybe we hook up
that'd be fun.
A round table, me, you, and him, to sort of to talk through some of these ideas, because there's a strong amount of overlap, and what I'd like to explore is, you know, where there is some potential inconsistencies, and how, you know, how maybe, you know, Bitcoin as a force of nature and as a force of reality sort of either validates or invalidates, you know, some of those impasses. Yeah,
that'd be fair, and I'd be happy to be there. I'd be happy to have that discussion, and to acknowledge, one, I'm not as super sharp on some of these subtle arguments as I once was or might need to be, and I might myself hold different opinions than what Ayn Rand held in the 1960s. Yes. Some of them might be because I disagree with them in principle or in general, and some might be because I think times have changed and some fundamental things have changed. But I think it'd be a fascinating conversation. So I'll listen to that episode, especially for sure, but especially if we're going to get the few of us together. And you should listen to this episode.
Yeah, deal. All right, my friend. Well, is there anything else you want to quickly mention here? Like, sort of, where can people find you? Are you active on Twitter or not really?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm at Tomer Strolight on Twitter. One of these laser-eyed Bitcoin maximalists. So I try to tweet a couple of times a day at least. Sometimes I'm on a real tear. Other times take a couple of days off. But I'm just spending a lot more time writing now. Now that I've decided that that's what I want to do. So I try to spend less time just shit posting on Twitter. But at Tomer Strolight on Twitter, at Tomer Strolight on Medium, which is where you'll find my articles. For the Love of Bitcoin, it's the podcast that we do. It's really about self-sovereignty. It's three guys who are deep Bitcoiners complaining about everything in the world and enjoying what's going right for Bitcoin. And that's probably about it for now. Right? Like that's where I put myself out there. And hopefully soon in fiction or other creative.
Brilliant. All right, Tom.
Yeah.
I really hope so too, man. I think the world needs some good fiction that is actually rooted in something that's likely to happen. So I will definitely be the first readers. So thank you again for coming, particularly on short notice. And yeah,
it's been great. I look forward to talking to you again, Alex.
Whether it's